Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing something a little bit different and a whole lot darker. We're going to unearth the classified, heavily redacted files of the 20th century's most terrifying psychological experiments. We're taking a deep dive into the history of forbidden psychology. You know, that Wild West era before modern ethical guardrails existed, when researchers were pushing the absolute boundaries of the human mind, often with devastating consequences. Just listen to this chilling quote. This is from George Hunter White, an operative who oversaw drug experiments for the CIA, and it perfectly sets the stage for our descent into the madness of government-sanctioned psychological torture. It completely captures that terrifying lack of accountability that, frankly, defined an entire era of human research. Part 1. The Architecture of Tyranny. Let's look at the Milgram and Stanford experiments. So right after the horrors of World War II, psychologists were desperate to understand how ordinary people could commit such massive atrocities. And the answer they found was a staggering 65%. That is the percentage of completely ordinary people in Stanley Milgram's 1961 Yale experiment who were perfectly willing to administer what they fully believed was a lethal 450-volt electric shock to another human being. They heard the screams, they saw the victim fall silent, they were sweating and trembling, but they pulled the lever anyway. Why? Simply because a scientist in a lab coat told them they had to. Fast forward a decade, and Philip Zimbardo decides to take this whole concept a step further, to see how systematic de-individuation basically breeds cruelty. In 1971, he turned the basement of the Stanford University psychology department into a mock prison. He gave the guards mirrored sunglasses so you couldn't see their eyes, and he referred to the prisoners only by numbers. And in just a matter of days, completely ordinary college students transformed into sadistic guards and passive, totally broken inmates. The psychological abuse ramped up so fast that prisoner 8612, a young guy named Douglas Corpy, suffered a complete mental breakdown. He was screaming these exact words after only 36 hours in that basement. The illusion of the prison had basically become a terrifying reality, which really goes to show just how fragile human identity actually is. It's honestly incredibly unsettling to think about. I want you to ask yourself honestly, looking into the mirror of these forbidden archives, what would it actually take to make you commit the unthinkable? We all like to believe we'd be the exception, right? But the data from these studies violently suggests otherwise. Which brings us to part 2, shattering the innocent mind, exploiting the vulnerable. So if your trust in human nature is feeling a bit shaky right now, we unfortunately have to turn to the horrific exploitation of people entirely unable to consent. What happens when ambitious researchers target the absolute most helpless members of society? Well, in the 1939 Monster Study at the University of Iowa, researchers claimed their noble goal was to treat and cure stuttering. But the reality was the deliberate psychological torment of helpless orphans. Kids who spoke perfectly normally were falsely labeled as stutterers and constantly berated until they developed lifelong anxieties and speech issues. And the orphanage staff was deliberately deceived to make this abuse happen. And you see this exact same dark pattern in the foundational texts of behaviorism. John B. Watson wanted to prove that fear could be conditioned. So, back in 1920, he took a hospitalized infant, known to history only as Little Albert, and systematically traumatized him. He basically terrorized a healthy baby boy with loud, clanging pipes every single time the kid tried to touch a white rat. The infant's permanent trauma was never unconditioned, and we don't even have a record of what happened to him. Part 3. The Stolen Identity of David Reimer. Dr. John Money's Twisted Experiment. Let's dig into the 1965 file of a boy whose entire life, his literal identity, was completely dismantled by a renowned Johns Hopkins psychologist. The inescapable torment of David Reimer started after a botched circumcision when he was an infant. Dr. John Money convinced Reimer's parents to raise him as a girl named Brenda. Why? Basically to use David to prove his own theory that gender is entirely a social construct. Money forced David and his twin brother into these deeply abusive, highly traumatic therapy sessions. And even though Money paraded this around as a massive scientific success, literally using it to justify thousands of sex reassignment surgeries for infants, David was actually living in severe psychological agony. He eventually reclaimed his male identity, but tragically took his own life at the age of 38. Moving on to Part 4, The Pits of Despair, Harry Harlow's Monkeys. Our descent into madness gets even deeper here with Harry Harlow. He was a really prominent scientist who deliberately tortured animals in this weird, highly mechanical quest to measure something as profound as love and attachment. He intentionally induced a horrifying clinical condition known as isolate syndrome in infant macaque monkeys. To study maternal deprivation, he locked these baby monkeys completely away from their mothers in wedge-shaped stainless steel isolation chambers, and he literally called these chambers the pits of despair. The result? Completely devastated animals exhibiting irreversible psychological damage. Just look at this cold, calculated admission from Harlow. It completely reveals the absolute void of empathy you would need to design such exquisite torture. For all his pioneering insights into the cognitive revolution and attachment theory, the sheer cost in animal suffering was astronomical. In fact, it was so bad it sparked some of the major early waves of the animal protection movement. Part 5. MK Ultra and Government Torture, the Abyss of Mind Control. Finally, we plunge into the absolute abyss. Because, it's one thing when rogue academics push the boundaries, right? But born out of Cold War paranoia in 1953, the CIA launched Project MK Ultra. This was institutionalized psychological torture, funded and directed by the absolute highest levels of government. This wasn't some science fiction movie. It was a massively funded initiative spread across 80 different institutions. The state actively subjected unconsenting citizens to LSD, heroin, and extreme psychological abuse. And the goal? To find a way to literally hack the human mind and bend it entirely to their will. One of the absolute most terrifying figures from this era was Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron up at the Allen Memorial Institute. He used a method he called depatterning. His goal was quite literally to erase an adult human mind, reducing his patients to the mental capacity of helpless infants. And he did this through months-long, chemically induced comas and hundreds of high-voltage electric shocks. So Cameron called this next step psychic driving. He basically tried to rebuild the shattered minds of his patients by locking them in isolation chambers, putting blacked-out football helmets on their heads, and blasting looped audio recordings at them for hours on end. Terrifyingly, these exact nightmarish sensory deprivation and psychological isolation techniques became the literal blueprint for modern military interrogations, later showing up in the CIA's Kubark Manual. Part 6. The Price of Progress. Ethics Written in Blood. So how did the psychological and scientific communities actually react to the massive trail of shattered minds left in the wake of all this unchecked research? Well, it's a pretty grim reality that our modern ethical guardrails didn't exactly come easily. The very rules and mandates that protect us today, like the evolution of the American Psychological Association's Code of Conduct and the strict requirement for institutional review boards, they were forged directly in the blood and trauma of these forgotten victims. Basically, every safeguard we rely on today exists because someone, somewhere in the past, crossed a horrific line. I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought. We look back at these case studies now with total shock, right? Comforted by the red tape that theoretically prevents them from happening today. But as long as there is an insatiable human drive to understand and control the mind, the boundaries of ethics are always going to be tested. The archives of the past might be closed, but the pursuit of knowledge never stops. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning what you learn.